So today I'm gonna just give you an overview of what I'm gonna talk about. I'm first gonna talk about and spend actually the majority of time talking about a brief biography of Angelique Renville because she had very distinct periods of her life that were very different. So I'll spend about 2/3 of the time talking about her biography, her life, and then I'll finish up with a brief discussion of sources. How did I go about researching and writing her story? So, as I was researching, writing her story, I really increasingly saw just the importance of her story as an important historical figure because her life intersected with such key historical events of the 19th century. For example, the decline of the fur trade in Minnesota, beginning in the early 19th century, land cessions beginning in the early 19th century up through the 1860s, of course, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, and more broadly, U.S. Indian policy, and then very specifically, missionary and government attempts to Christianize and quote unquote civilize all American Indians. Her story also illustrates both the constraints she faced as an American Indian woman living in the 19th century, but also her resistance, resilience, and survival. And then finally, as I'm going to talk about at the very end, her story illustrates what sources you can use and how you write American Indian history in general. So I'm going to dive right into her biography and start at the beginning. Angelique E. Renville, and unfortunately, I never found out what the E stands for, was born April 1st, 1845 in southwestern Minnesota, likely Lac Qui Parle. And you can see with the map on the upper right, Lac Qui Parle is located in southwestern Minnesota. Today, it is a state park. And I have been there. It has a beautiful lake, and it also has a reconstructed church that the missionaries built and that Angelique would have attended. Her parents were Joseph and Therese, both Dakota. So in her early years, so from her birth through the age of 6, she lived with her Dakota relatives at various locations throughout southwestern Minnesota. So she would have grown up as a Dakota girl would have grown up, meaning that she mostly lived with her mother and other female relatives from whom she would have learned traditional Dakota gender roles. And that included farming. So you can see on the upper left-hand picture that Dakota women and then children were the ones who were largely in charge of farming. So that is a picture of a cornfield, and they built those structures to scare away crows and other predators from the corn. And then she also might have played with a doll to teach her, again, kind of Dakota gender roles. She also was part of Fur Trade Society. Her grandfather was a prominent fur trader, and he established his base at Lac Qui Parle. In Minnesota in the 19th century, mixed ancestry men and women, like Angelique, followed various cultural patterns. Some adopted American or Canadian identities, while others lived with their maternal Dakota relatives. So one historian called Lac Qui Parle a multifaceted society where Dakota people moved back and forth between Dakota, mixed ancestry, and white communities, depending on the circumstances. And you can really see this illustrated in Angelique's life, especially her early years. So, as I said, Angelique was born into a time of great historical significance to the Dakota Nation, and it was a time of great change. So, her early life would have intersected with the decline of the fur trade in Minnesota, land cessions beginning in the 1830s and accelerating in the 1850s, and the arrival of Protestant missionaries in 1835. So each of these issues would have had major influences on Angelique and her relatives. So you can see in the map that there were smaller land cessions leading up to the major land cession in 1851, where the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota ceded all of the Dakota lands in Minnesota and combined them to a small diagonal reservation that was impermanent, and you can see that on the map as well. Now, I did want to highlight one of the earlier treaties because it would really set the stage for a lot of what would happen to Angelique, her relatives, and especially her sister, Agnes. And that was the Treaty of 1830, which established a so-called half-breed tract. That is the wording that was used in the treaty, located on the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin. And according to this treaty, 640 acres of this tract would be distributed to each so-called half-breed Dakota, whose status would be confirmed by as a yet undeveloped tribal role. So this tribal role was taken in 1855 through 56. And as you can see on the lower right, Angelique and her relatives received acres on this tract, according to this role. So Angelique and each of her siblings received 480 acres. And you can see that when she first received these acres, she was 10 years old. And her closest sister, Agnes, was 8. Now, she's now about to enter a very different and distinct period of her life, because in 1851, at the age of 6, Angelique was adopted, and that is the word that the missionaries used. They used the word adopted by Stephen and Mary Riggs. The Riggs were Protestant missionaries affiliated with the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or the ABCFM, which was one of the most prominent missionary organizations of the time. It was Congregationalist and Presbyterian mainly. So Angelique went to live in the Riggs home with their 8 children at the Lac Qui Parle mission. And she would live with the Riggs family for the next 10 years until the age of 16. So Angelique, along with one other Dakota girl, was the child who lived the longest with these Protestant missionaries. Now, the entire Riggs family worked to raise Angelique to become a civilized, as they called it, and Christian woman. And the photograph at the right illustrates the type of mission home Angelique would have lived in and the school she would have attended, as well as the donated clothing that she would have worn during her time with the Riggs family. So this is actually another similar Protestant mission. You can see in the back is the 2-story home that she would have lived in. Most of these homes are pretty cramped in that the missionary families were quite large. And then they had Dakota children like Angelique living with them as well as sometimes missionary teachers. And then in the forefront of this picture is the school, and it sometimes would have been used as a church as well. So Angelique attended mission school. When she was young and first arrived with the Riggs, she would have attended class with other Dakota children. But as she aged and then learned more English, she actually attended class with other missionary children. So beginning in the 1830s, the missionaries wanted to make the oral Dakota language into a written language. And they did this, you can see in the middle picture, by grafting the English alphabet onto Dakota sounds. And one of their goals was to have Dakota men, women, and children become literate as quickly as they possibly could, because they believed that when they could read the Bible, they would be converted more quickly. So they did translate the Bible into the Dakota language. Now, Angelique would have learned to read in the Dakota language, but then would have transitioned to learning to read and write in English. And you can see on the left that there is a lesson, and they had primers that the children would read that were in both English and Dakota. And then on the far right, I have the first written document that I have from Angelique. She wrote that at age 9. and it was to Miss Spooner, who was a mission teacher that Angelique had gone to school with and then actually had boarded with in the Riggs home. Now, I want to talk about something that was important for Angelique as she went to live with the Riggs, and that is guardianship. That according to Minnesota law in the 1850s, Stephen Riggs could apply to become Angelique and her sister's Agnes's legal guardian. So I studied Minnesota statutes in the 1850s. And according to Minnesota law at the time, a judge could appoint a guardian for a minor under the age of 14 whose father was deceased and whose mother was unmarried and deemed, quote unquote, incompetent. In the 1850s, guardianships for females last until the age of 21 or their marriage. In 1863, when Angelique turned 18, the statute had changed, and guardianship for females was supposed to end at the age of 18 or upon their marriage. And here's a really important point of guardianship law. Once appointed, guardians had the legal right to sell their ward's real estate or other parts of their estate to pay for their, quote, maintenance and education. So this is what Stephen Riggs set out to do. In March of 1857, Stephen Riggs filed paperwork with the court in Minnesota to obtain the legal guardianship of Angelique, who was 13 at the time, and her sister Agnes, who was 11. Now, according to Minnesota statute, her father had passed away from tuberculosis. So her father had passed away, but her mother was alive and well. The court ruled that Therese and the girls' other Dakota relatives were unfit to be their guardian, as they were, quote, without means of support or education and totally disqualified to discharge the general duties of civilized life, they being of Dakota and French blood mixed. In other words, the court declared that her mother was incompetent by virtue of being a Dakota woman. So Steve Riggs became the girls' guardian, and as such, he now legally controlled their combined 960 acres of script. In 1857, just 2 months before the court even declared the Renville sisters to be his wards, Riggs announced his intent to attend to getting the script and locating them for their girls and to sell their lands for their improvement. And he could legally do that once he became guardian. And just as a side note, I don't know how many of you have seen Killers of the Flower Moon or read the book or heard what happened to the Osage in Oklahoma in the early 20th century. But one of the ways that their land was taken from them was by appointing non-Osage guardians to control Osage lands. So the same thing happened to Angelique and her sister just 60 years earlier than what happened to the Osage. So moving forward to another distinct time in Angelique's life, at the age of 16, after living with the missionaries for 10 years, Angelique was sent by the Riggs family to Ohio to attend the Ohio Female College, which was a seminary for daughters of middle and mainly upper-class Euro-American families, and it was located in Cincinnati. And Angelique traveled there with one of the missionary daughters named Martha Riggs. So Stephen Riggs stated he paid for her college by finally selling 120 acres of her script. So as her guardian, he could do that without getting her mother's permission and without getting Angelique's permission. Now, life was pretty difficult for Angelique at the Ohio Female College for multiple reasons. And I know this because Angelique wrote many letters from the Ohio Female College back to the Riggs telling her about the trouble she faced. So from the get-go, she was placed into the lower 2-year course with much younger students. So most of the students in this secondary preparatory course were 12, and then she was 16 or 17. So obviously a very big age gap between her and the other students in her course. She was placed in fewer classes than other students. And at first, she was not allowed to take Latin like the other students. And she wrote a lot in her letters about her desire to take Latin. She also was made fun of by the younger girls. She wrote just heart-wrenching letters about how, especially at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the younger girls just made fun of her. And she talked about having to learn to ignore them and not react. The missionary daughter, Martha, who also attended the school, was often asked to speak for Angelique as if she was not in the room. So, for example, one time Angelique wrote about how they were making clothing for Civil War soldiers because she was at the school during the Civil War. And another girl asked Martha, well, can she sew? When Angelique was right there in the room. Angelique wrote that the only time the girls wanted to talk to her was so that they could use her, quote, Indian stories in their own compositions. She was also chastised by the Riggs for spending too much money, even though that money was from her own script. Now, it wasn't all terrible that the girls didn't have the funds to go back to Minnesota over winter break, over spring break. So they stayed with various friends of the family around Cincinnati. And Angelique wrote about loving taking the omnibus. She went to some theaters. So she did have some times that were positive at the school. However, after her first year, she was not allowed to return to the Ohio Female College. I am not 100% sure why. She did write that she did not do well in her classes and her final exams. She wrote, I'm very much disappointed about my reports, for I had studied very hard and tried to get them. I hope I will have better ones the next time. But there wasn't a next time because the school did not allow her back. Now, I know that the school sent a letter explaining why she couldn't return, but it was lost in transit due to the outbreak of the U.S. Dakota War in 1862. So at this point, she enters another phase in her life, which was a residence with the Drake family. So Angelique, in her letters, expressed a desire to return to her family in Minnesota. But the Riggs family decided that she should remain in East Walnut Hills, which was a neighborhood in Cincinnati. And she would board with William and Lucy Spooner Drake and their children. And she actually had lived with Lucy Drake before. She had been a teacher at the Lockheed Pearl Mission in the 1850s, and the two had actually shared a room in the Riggs home. So Stephen and Mary Riggs decided that Angelique would move in with the Drake family so that she could work on remedial schoolwork in preparation for further studies. So they wanted her to return to school either in Cincinnati or to go to another female seminary in Rockford, Illinois. No existing letters indicate that Angelique, her mother, or any other of her Dakota relatives were part of this decision. And again, legally, as her guardian, Stephen Riggs could continue to make all of the choices for the just underaged Angelique. So she was 17 at the time she moved in with the Drake family. So he could do that despite what she wanted. So as I said, Angelique was supposed to study while she was with the Drake family, but things turned out very differently. That during her time with the Drake family, Lucy Drake was very sick. So instead of studying, Angelique ended up working as an unpaid servant. She cleaned, baked, she did the laundry, which she wrote about hating. She hated doing laundry. And she also took care of the Drake children. Drake admitted that due to her ill health, Angelique has been obliged to work more than I would have had her. So she took care of the home. On August 17th, 1862, only a few short months after Angelique arrived at the Drake home, the U.S. Dakota War broke out in Minnesota. And once the war broke out, Angelique asked and then begged to return to her family in Minnesota. That obviously it was a traumatic time. She knew what was happening in Minnesota and she wanted to be with her family. The missionaries said no. They said it was best for her to remain in Ohio. They said it was safer. And more importantly, they explicitly wanted to keep her away from her mother, whom they called a poor influence on her children. During the war, Agnes passed away from measles. And again, this just increased Angelique's desire to go home to be with her family, and especially her mother in these trying times. Again, Stephen Riggs refused to send her money to travel back to Minnesota. And of course, this was her prerogative until April 1st, 1863, when she turned 18. But even when she turned 18, Riggs still refused to send her money to travel back to Minnesota. In July of 1863, Stephen Riggs finally sent her money to go home. And this is one of my favorite parts of Angelique's biography, because I think she really manipulated the system to get what she wanted from the missionaries, that she told Lucy Drake that it would, quote, be her greatest care and delight to work as the Riggs' chief housekeeper. So when they heard that she would return to be their chief housekeeper, Stephen Riggs sent her the money and she returned to Minnesota. She briefly stopped at the Riggs home, but then left permanently. She traveled to Dakota Territory, where she rejoined her mother and her brother for working as scouts in Dakota Territory. Now, at this point, the Riggs were upset with Angelique that they had invested a lot of time and effort in her education, both religious and otherwise, and they were upset that they returned to her kin. But they were horrified that she married Charles Crawford, a Dakota man. So ideally, the missionaries wanted Angelique to marry a Euro-American man who befit her status as a civilized and Christian Dakota woman. The problem, however, was not that Charles was a Dakota man, nor that he was a scout. To the missionaries, his unforgivable sin was polygamy. He was married to another Dakota woman at the time. When he married Angelique, he did not put away, and that is the phrase that the missionaries used, that in order to be part of their church, they needed to put away the other wife. So the missionaries then devised numerous and elaborate plans to rescue Angelique and return her to the Riggs home. And they almost thought that she had been brainwashed, to use kind of a more contemporary phrase, by Charles Crawford, because there's no way that she would have committed the sin of polygamy without being manipulated by Charles. Now, at first, according to her letters, Angelique apologized to the missionaries for her actions and expressed regret. But as the months passed, Angelique became increasingly irritated with the missionaries over their response to her marriage, and she gave up her initial attempts at reconciliation. She wrote that she, quote, was never coming back. And the missionaries did not take this well. There is a one-page obituary of Angelique written by Martha Riggs. And in this obituary, Martha Riggs continued to express anger at Angelique's choices. She reported that Angelique, quote, threw away whatever opportunity she might have had for being and doing good. All of her training was worse than wasted. She ended up living a wasted life. Truthfully, it's one of kind of the harshest obituaries I've read. So once Angelique moved to Dakota Territory, she returned to kind of the gender roles in life of the first 6 years of her life, in that she lived and worked with the other Dakota women of her community. She had a daughter with Charles, whom she named Augusta, and she also retained very strong ties with her Renville kin, and especially her mothers and brothers in Dakota Territory, and then on the Lake Traverse Reservation in what would later become the state of South Dakota. I want to return to guardianship for a minute, because even after she moved to Dakota Territory, she was over the age of 18 and she was married. So by the law, she should have been emancipated, but that was not the case. That Stephen Riggs continued to be her guardian and control her remaining script into the late 1860s. Now, Stephen Riggs actually wanted to terminate her guardianship as well, but the sticking issue was her debt. Since the 1850s, when Angelique went to live with Stephen Riggs, he kept a very detailed ledger of all her debts to him. He wrote down everything that he spent on her. And then he also charged her 6% interest a year. I went down a little research rabbit hole for a while there trying to see if it was legal to charge interest on a guardianship debt. I never found the answer, but the court allowed it, so I assume it was legal. But because of the interest in the debt, by 1866, she owed him $161.50, which is equal to about $2,800 today. In summer of 1866, Riggs began an all-out campaign to end Angelique's guardianship. He wanted her to agree to let him sell an additional 120 acres of her land to pay off her debt, and then she would be free of her guardianship. He drew up all the papers. He was very sure that she would sign it, and then she refused to sign the papers. So the two were at a standstill for years. And indeed, when she passed away, I believe that she was still officially under his guardianship. Oh, in addition to her troubles with Riggs over her guardianship, some shady land sharks, and that is the term that was used in a lot of the court documents and papers, newspapers of the time. So some shady land sharks stole the last of her script. In 1869, she found and hired a lawyer to get her lands back. She informed her lawyer that she had been imposed upon and shamefully deceived in the sale of her last acres, as her signature had been procured under very false pretenses. She specifically claimed she had unknowingly signed a power of attorney. She angrily called the transaction a swindle and asked her lawyer to look after this for me. I wish to be paid for my land, or I want my land back. Her lawyer did take the case. He filed a complaint with the county court. He said that his client's land had been illegally stolen from her. However, as I read through the complaint that Cox filed on Angelique's behalf, he really represented her in very stereotypical ways. He described Angelique as, quote, ignorant, uninformed, and naive and trusting. He wrote that she was ignorant of the wiles of designing men, of being of Dakota blood, and understanding the English language imperfectly, which is just a very strange thing for him. I guess not too strange given the climate of the time, but he had complete evidence to the contrary in that she wrote him a letter hiring him in perfect English, that he took a deposition from her, again, she spoke in perfect English. The judge dismissed her case without any compensation for attorney's fees or redress for her stolen lands. So she did lose her court case. On May 30th, 1876, Angelique Renville Crawford passed away from tuberculosis at the age of 31, surrounded by her husband and Renville kin on the Lake Traverse Reservation. When she passed away, she had not gotten her land back, nor, as far as I can tell, had her guardianship legally ended. She did, however, live her life on her own terms, despite the constraints she faced as an American Indian woman. she showed resilience, strength, and ingenuity against multiple actors who attempted to control her life and land. I would also argue she used the skills that she had learned from her years in the mission schools and at the Ohio Female College to hire a lawyer to fight for her land and her family. So I just want to take maybe 5 minutes to now talk about how did I research and write Angelique Renville's story. I have a picture of a puzzle here because especially writing her history was to me like putting together a puzzle, that I was taking bits and pieces from very disparate sources and putting them together to try to tell a whole. So one of the most unique sources I used were the words of Angelique herself, that I found 14 letters written by Angelique Renville. The earliest was from 1854 when she was 9, and the latest was from 1870 when she was 25. So it was just amazing to hear what she had to say about her life at the Ohio Female College, living with the Drake family, renouncing the missionaries after she returned to Minnesota, and then her struggle to get her land back. So it's a rare and invaluable source. I also used a lot of missionary letters as they were in her life for over a decade. Now, what was interesting to me is that from the 1850s to the 60s, the missionaries mention her constantly in their correspondence. And I thought I would continue to see those mentions. The missionaries wrote a lot, like literally hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of letters. And as I was looking through their correspondence from the 1860s to 70s, I found hardly any mentions. And to me, as I kind of try to wrap my head around that disparity, it kind of made sense to me in that from the 1850s to the 60s, she was living in their home. She joined the mission church. She went to school. But then when she left the missionaries, to a certain extent, they kind of erased her from their world, as probably she was okay with that. I also used census records, although to me, these are the most frustrating and to a certain extent useless sources, in that the census takers were Euro-Americans, and they focused on nuclear families. They wanted a mother, father, and their children. Whereas I mentioned Dakota families didn't always fit into that mold, in that Angelique's father had multiple wives. Angelique herself was part of a polygamous marriage, and the census never recorded that. So the census records I found were incomplete and showed just kind of what the census records found at that time, and then kind of grafted it onto their own view of how families should be organized. And finally, one of the most unique sources I found were court records. So initially, I found out that there was a court case by reading Angelique's letter hiring Eugene St. Julian Cox. And then Dr. Jimmy Sweet told me that, you can search online land records. And just as a side note, probably 95% of my research was done during COVID and the shutdown. So I really relied a lot on online sources, such as online land records. And then once I was able to go to archives, I was able to kind of fill in the gaps. And one of the gaps that I found were the actual court records. And I found those in the Minnesota Historical Society. And I have Eugene St. Julian Cox's brief where he was saying that she should get her land back. And then I have the court decision saying that she failed. So I feel like I've talked very quickly because I was trying to make up a little time. So I would love to hear your questions, and I will stop sharing right now.
Right. Oh, that was so wonderful, Linda. I love this story. And I did not mention when I was introducing Linda that this is indeed a South Dakota Historical Society Press book that came out in September. And working on this book was just such a joy for all of us, because I hope you caught when Linda said how rare it is to have a cache of letters from a 19th century American Indian woman. And there's probably a handful of women who left letters like that. So what a great find on Linda's part. So does anyone have questions? And I think
I
Judy is
just saw one come up
leading
on the
along. Judy Beckman?
chat. The chat question was tuberculosis common at the time? Absolutely, especially among Native Americans and Indian reservations at the time. And in fact, there was a lot of medical literature at the time that said that Native Americans were especially open to getting tuberculosis in very kind of racialized ways. They said that they were kind of defective in some ways. Now, tuberculosis is spread through poor conditions, such as were on Indian reservations. So, yes, tuberculosis was rampant on Indian reservations, and it was not because Native Americans were affected, defective in any way. It was because of the conditions that they were living under. So Angelique's father died of tuberculosis, and then Angelique herself died of tuberculosis. So it was unfortunately very common in the late 19th, early and into the early 20th century.
I think Judy Beckman was waving at me. Is that right? Judy, did you
That
have a
is,
question? Okay.
I did. So I assume these names, Angelique and Agnes, were not their Dakota names.
That is an excellent question. So it was part of the thing I was going to say, and then for time, kind of cut out. So Angelique and Agnes, they were part of Fur Trade Society. So they were given kind of French, Angelique, Agnes, they were given French names. They would have had Dakota names as well. Unfortunately, I never found out what those Dakota names were. The missionaries' goal was to take away their Dakota identity, their language, their names. So when Angelique wrote her letters, they were in English, and she used the name Angelique. So it is a great regret that I did not find out what their Dakota names were, because they were operating first kind of in French Fur Trade Society and then Euro-American Society.
Interesting. Thank you.
So we have a question on the chat about what does ABCFM mean?
American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which is a mouthful. So that's why it's ABCFM. It was the most prominent missionary organization of the 19th century. They mainly focused on missions abroad. So to Turkey, to China, to Hawaii. But they also did have missions to Native American communities, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Dakota. So their main focus, though, was further abroad.
Yeah, that's great. Lots of interesting stuff with the ABCFM. Liz Onley has her hand up.
I have a couple. One, I was curious if there's a lot written about sort of the missionaries having such a direct impact. Like, are there other studies of similar situations where they take such a personal interest in the education and identity of people? And then I was also curious what happened with her to her daughter. Like, what was her daughter's life like?
Yes. So in answer to your first question, absolutely. So this was before federal boarding schools. So the missionaries, it was kind of the same idea of the federal boarding schools of the late 19th century, that they would take Indian children into their homes so that they could speak English, learn what were called proper gender roles, attend school. So yes, this is very, very common, not just with the Dakota, but with the Cherokee. Narcissa Whitman was a missionary in Oregon. She actually, along with her husband, was killed by Native peoples at the same time that Angelique was living. And they also adopted, as it was called, Indian children into their homes. So yes, it was very common. And in answer to your second question, it is my greatest regret, besides the fact that I didn't find a picture of Angelique Renville, I do not know what happened to her daughter. And that kind of goes to my point of census records, that to a certain extent they're useless because of the type of relationship she was in, that it was viewed as invalid. So they didn't record it. I did get in touch with a great-great-granddaughter of Charles Crawford, and Charles Crawford lived until his 80s and had many children. So I don't know. As much as I wish I did, I don't know what happened to her daughter. It is my assumption that given the conditions on the reservation, that she did pass away, but I am not 100% sure.
We've got some more questions in the chat. So I'm going to kind of go in relation to what we've been talking to. So first of all, speaking of relations, was Angelique related to Gabriel Renville?
Yeah. Okay. And I don't have the genealogy in front of me, but yes, she was. And certainly on the Lake Traverse Reservation, that she was very, very involved in her community with Gabriel, with her brothers, and with other members of the Renville family. But I'm drawing a blank on the actual relationship.
I think it's through Joseph, but don't quote me on that. We have a book on Gabriel Renville too.
Yes.
By Gary Clayton Anderson.
And I should know that. It's been a long day. It's finals week at ISU, and I'm drawing a blank.
And I used to know that too. So I don't anymore. Okay, so question about the ABCFM. Were they part of Yale or Harvard from the East Coast?
Harvard. And in fact, the original papers of the ABCFM are all housed at the library, the Rare Book Library at Harvard. And I did go there and look at the papers, but they've all been digitized now. So that kind of goes to what I said about the way I could research this book during COVID was because so many of these wonderful sources are now available from my living room in Central Illinois.
That's a wonder of all the digitization. And I'm going to put a little plug in with that because it's something that it does actually take quite a bit of money to do the digitization process. And that's something that at the State Archives, in South Dakota, we have quite a few projects lined up that we'd like to digitize, but we're looking for sponsors for those in specific collections. So there is a list of those on the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation page if you're interested in making a particular digitization project happen. Okay, so Judy Beckman, I might have you say this for us. So Judy's telling us how to pronounce. It's not Lucky Pearl, it's like Queep.
It's like
okay, I'm butchering it. I'm sorry. Say it again.
I'm sorry. You know what? I was a French major as well, so I do apologize. I was pronouncing it like I was in French class.
That's right. Say it again, Judy.
That's true everywhere that, you know, there are local pronunciations, but here they say Laquaparl, Quip,
Okay.
Laquaparl.
Okay.
Thank
and
you.
Judy lives next to that.
And that does go though to that Angelique and her relatives were bilingual or trilingual in many cases, speaking both French, Dakota, and then English. And one story that I love that I didn't tell was that Angelique and her soon-to-be husband Charles communicated in Ohio in the Dakota language because the missionaries would not have approved. They knew this. So they used one of Angelique's cousins in Minnesota to send letters and be kind of the conduit and they wrote in the Dakota language so that Lucy Spooner Drake didn't know what they were talking about and that they were corresponding.
It's a great story. So you have a greeting from Central Illinois from Jana Lynn, and she wants to know how you first came across Angelique, which is a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in my first and second book, they both look at interaction between ABCF and missionaries and the Dakota. And as I was researching, I found some of the letters that Angelique wrote, and it was kind of in the back of my head that I would love to do something with them at some point in time. And so it was just coming upon this letter and thinking, oh my goodness, this is a letter written by a Dakota woman in English. And it kind of went from there. And it also fit in with my interests of early 19th century antebellum religion and interaction with Protestant missionaries. So it kind of continued the trajectory of the research of my two other books as well, but on a more personal level because it's a biography.
So fascinating. All right. Well, we have hit 8 o'clock and we're always trying to be punctual. And we thank you for your time this evening and for sharing this wonderful presentation with us. I know we've all learned a lot from Linda. So thank you so much, Linda, for sharing your time with us. And you all probably know at the end, this is the end of the fall semester for history professors, all professors. They're all like grading and kind of just like, I don't know, barely making it, right? Ready to get done with the semester. So we thank Linda doubly for sharing this time with us in the middle of trying to end her semester.